you that person who always envisioned themselves learning how to code and getting a really awesome job at the end of it? Maybe you tried a couple times, but for some reason there was always this invisible barrier and the whole thing just never clicked. Yeah, so me too. I tried quite a few times since my youth to pick up programming because I was always told by gurus and stuff that it was so easy, everyone can learn, and it's a great way into an awesome paying career. But for some reason, it just never clicked with me. It just never worked. But every single time I failed, and I just did not understand. It seemed to come so easy to everyone else that I just figured I must be pretty stupid. And unfortunately, this route just wasn't for me. Fast forward to today, 20 years later since I actually first got this idea, and somehow I've started to get it, and I've made the most progress ever. So what's new? It's actually got nothing to do with programming itself, and more about learning the difference between the mindset of those who succeed and those who do not. So subscribe if you like what you see. My name is Alex, nice to meet you, and let me share what I've recently learned about what makes a good programmer. I think the first catalyst was just time. So my first exposure to anything coding related was, and this show my age a little bit, was I used to use a site called Neopets when I was younger. And it allowed you to create your own little personal web page. It was really restrictive, it was terrible, and I didn't get it. Over the years, I've tried to learn a few more times and it never quite stuck. And I think a big reason of this is that back in the day before, it wasn't quite as obvious to connect where those skills actually applied to the real world. But nowadays, because we basically half live digital lives, it's a lot easier to see where these skills are actually being used and employed in the world. The resources nowadays are also so much better, and there's so many options. You know, you've got videos, courses, interactive web apps, online communities. Also the realization that in this modern digital world, if you don't have these skills, you're at a really big disadvantage, especially if you've got some kind of entrepreneurial mindset, because before everyone was kind of on the same footing, but if you don't have this knowledge, this skill set, you're at a really big disadvantage. I think all of these combined basically means that the modern world much better facilitates learning than it used to. Okay, so story time. What actually was it that I did this time that was different? So I actually had a family member who took on a skills bootcamp. Now, to my knowledge, they didn't have any prior experience in the world of tech, but they took on this bootcamp and they've now actually started a career in tech, which is really awesome to see. So basically, I copied them. Here is an example of someone succeeding, and if they can do it, then maybe I can do it too. So I found a bootcamp, but to actually gain access to it, I needed to do a preliminary course to understand the basics of JavaScript. I had about 2 or 3 weeks to complete it, which is actually really good for me because the fact that it was a deadline, a time limit, meant I couldn't procrastinate and I had to get on with it. So this really helped focus me, and as I was going through this introductory course, I was absorbing the knowledge a lot better. By the end of it, I felt very prepared, more prepared than I'd ever before that I was going to succeed at this, because to get onto the actual course, I had to do an entry challenge, but I failed. And the reason I failed was basically because I was too slow. Despite the fact that I got about 80% of the way there on most questions, the fact of the matter is that I didn't complete most of the questions. At first, I thought this was a little bit unfair because, you know, I'm slow, I'm a slow burner, and this is always going to be a disadvantage for me. But then I realized that it didn't even really matter. Up to this point, everything was self-directed. I'd learned everything by myself. I knew I was slow, and while the idea is appealing of help and guidance, realistically, if you're going to succeed at this, if you're really going to excel at this, you're going to have to do it by yourself anyway, and you need to become your own advocate for your own self-learning. So this was actually a really important first lesson in that, yes, everyone has their weaknesses, but you can't allow them to define or limit you. But also, if you don't succeed at first, then just try again and try something new. So I decided to just continue this journey self-directed. Normally I would give these kind of things up, but seeing as I'd already invested some time into it and I was understanding it a lot better than before, I wanted to see how far I could take this self-directed. So JavaScript is where I started, and I think this was a really important place to start because understanding the logic is integral if you want to do anything complex. But like a lot of people, I consider myself to be more of a visual learner. So while I could understand the basic logic of what was going on with the JavaScript, I could sort an array, I wasn't sure how to connect that concept with things that I'd actually be doing in the real world. So of course I had to learn HTML. This is something that I was kind of dragging my feet on because HTML is a little bit dry. But if you consider yourself to be a visual learner, then web dev and web design is really the place to start. And for that, HTML is essential. A lot of people suggest that you should start a project and that's the best way to learn. So I decided on a project. I was going to build this kind of form builder. So if you imagine like a survey or a quiz, I got to work and I started learning about the DOM and how to control the DOM and how HTML and JavaScript kind of work together. This was really fun for a little bit, but I quickly realized that I couldn't make this just with HTML and JavaScript. There's clearly something missing, and that was CSS. But again, I was dragging my feet on this because I'd already learnt JavaScript and started learning HTML, and I kind of resented having to start something yet again. This part here is really important because this mindset does not work if you want to be a coder or a programmer. You need to open your mind. You can't drag your feet. You can't be reluctant to learn new technologies. And I did start to learn CSS, and it quickly became obvious that CSS is integral. And it would be absolute madness to say, I'm not going to learn CSS. If you were doing web design, web dev, of course you need to know CSS. Okay, so I now know, the basics of JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. I should be all good because this is the trifecta. No, we're not done. As I was building this form builder, I also ran into a new problem. If I wanted some level of customization, then I'm going to need to store the information somewhere. So where do I store it? Do I store it in like a notepad file, like a JSON file? This was really confusing me until I was introduced to the idea of databases. But I didn't just need to know about databases, I need to know about stuff like promises and networking and APIs and stuff. And this is when I started laughing a little bit because I realized that this is probably the knowledge that I was missing all along. It's not that I needed to learn a programming language. It's that I needed to gain the skill to identify the tools that I'm going to need to learn to solve problems as they come. So beyond actual coding, like the actual skill of the knowledge of coding, this was probably the most important realization, the biggest eye-opener, is that what sets people who succeed at programming and those who don't, it's not actually about this innate inherent skill or talent or knowledge or coding. It is the ability to accept that you are never going to know everything. You're always going to be working on some level of half knowledge. And there is never going to be that day where you say, I've just done this and suddenly I know programming. I don't just learn a language and you're done. This is a infinite, continuous, forever learning experience. And it's the willingness to accept that you must work on this half knowledge and still manage to thrive. Even if you don't understand everything you're working with, you need to accept what you do know and what you don't know and continue to persist. You cannot be presented with new knowledge or opportunities or new information that you must absorb and reject it. You need to have an open mind and acknowledge that there is always something new to learn. Look, am I a master? Not at all. I'm still very much beginner, very basic knowledge. I'm still very much struggling with organization, functions, callbacks. It's all very confusing still, and I've still got so much to learn. But my knowledge has increased. And I know more than I used to know for sure. What I always just thought was a character flaw, something that was part of my personality that gave me an inability to learn to code, was actually more to do with my mindset. And the difference between successful people and not successful people isn't about natural talent necessarily. It's about dealing with the now and how you're going to solve this solution, even if you don't necessarily know how to solve it right this second. Also, you need to remember not to be intimidated by others' knowledge. In my search for new information, I often found myself on places like Stack Overflow and Reddit, and you encounter a lot of people who seem to know a lot and they like to project their knowledge. This can make you feel like a little bit insecure, like you don't know anything and everyone else is just so much smarter than you. And some people are like way smarter than you. But all you gotta remember is that the only thing that really matters is that you understand something, and you understand things in your own way. You don't need to understand it like they understand it, or at least the way they're projecting to understand it. Encounter this knowledge, absorb the knowledge, and build your own mental models for understanding, because at the end of the day, you need to understand it in your own way, and how other people are understanding it doesn't matter. So what is it that I really learned here? Well, it's basically acknowledging that you're never going to know everything, you're never going to be a master at everything, and the true successful person is someone who accepts this, understands knowledge that they don't have, and sources the knowledge to bridge that gap.